Right now, sitting in your pocket, is a chip that can perform 40 trillion calculations every single second. And most people have absolutely no idea what that even means. Back in 1990, that exact same amount of computing power would have cost you $200 million, required an entire building to house it, and needed its own dedicated power plant just to keep it running. Today, it fits in a device you accidentally leave on the couch. This isn't just a story about graphics cards or gaming. This is the story of the single most important invention of the last 35 years, a piece of technology that started its life drawing simple triangles on a screen and ended up becoming the engine that runs artificial intelligence for the entire planet. This is every GPU generation, from 1990 all the way to 2026, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you will never look at your computer the same way again. To understand how revolutionary GPS became, you first need to understand just how bad things were before they existed. In 1990, there was no such thing as a GPU. Your CPU, the main processor of the computer, was responsible for doing absolutely everything at the same time, running your operating system, calculating your spreadsheets, and also drawing every single pixel you saw on screen, all simultaneously. The result of asking one chip to do all of that at once was exactly what you'd expect: slow, ugly, and completely flat. Games in this era were entirely 2D, and a rectangle moving across the screen pretending to be a spaceship was considered genuinely impressive technology. Graphics cards did exist, but their only job was to help display 2D images faster, moving windows around the desktop, rendering text, nothing more. Companies like S3, Trident, and Matrox dominated this space, and their entire purpose was simply to take whatever the CPU had already drawn and get it onto your monitor a little quicker. Nobody in the mainstream was seriously thinking about real-time 3D graphics. Nobody, that is, except one small startup working out of a garage in California that was about to change everything. In 1996, a company called 3DFX released a product called the Voodoo. And despite being ugly, expensive, and requiring you to actually install a second separate card just to handle basic 2D display, it became one of the most important pieces of hardware ever made for gaming. The reason nobody cared about its many inconveniences was simple. The moment you plugged it in and launched a game like Quake, the entire world changed in front of your eyes. For the very first time, a consumer computer was rendering actual real-time 3D graphics, texture-mapped walls, real depth, smooth fluid movement, and the reaction from people who experienced it for the first time was nothing short of complete and total amazement. Internet cafes full of teenagers were losing their minds, and the Voodoo 2 that followed in 1998 pushed things even further, making 3DFX feel completely untouchable and unbeatable in the market. But while 3DFX was celebrating and growing arrogant, assuming they had already permanently won the graphics card war, a company they hadn't taken seriously enough was quietly building something that would completely destroy them. And that company was NVIDIA. On August 31st of 1999, NVIDIA released the GeForce 256, and in doing so, they did something that nobody else in the industry had ever done before. They marketed it not as a graphics card or an accelerator or a display adapter, but as a GPU, a graphics processing unit. And that name change was not just marketing, it was a declaration of a fundamentally different philosophy. The GeForce 256 was the first consumer chip that could handle geometry calculations and lighting directly on the card itself, without constantly asking the CPU for assistance, which freed up the main processor to focus on everything else and made the entire system dramatically faster. Meanwhile, 3DFX was collapsing under the weight of their own mistakes. Their Voodoo 5 arrived late, cost too much, and the company was burning through cash at an unsustainable rate, leading NVIDIA to purchase their entire asset portfolio in the year 2000 for what amounted to almost nothing. A new competitor quickly stepped in to fill the rivalry gap, however, as ATI entered the market seriously with their Radeon DDR, officially kickstarting a GPU war between NVIDIA and ATI that would rage for the next 25 years and ultimately benefit consumers enormously. Then, in 2001, NVIDIA released the GeForce 3, which introduced programmable shaders for the first time, meaning that for the first time ever, developers could write their own custom code that would run directly on the graphics chip. And while almost nobody at the time fully grasped the long-term implications of that capability, it would eventually change the entire world. In 2002, ATI struck back hard with the Radeon 9700 Pro, a card that beat NVIDIA's GeForce 4 Ti in nearly every single benchmark test and represented the strongest ATI had ever looked in the market up to that point. The period that followed became known as the Shader Wars, because each new generation of hardware from both companies was defined almost entirely by adding more shader processing power, more programmability, and more visual complexity than whatever came before it. DirectX 9 arrived as the new standard, and games like Half-Life 2 and Doom 3 pushed the technology to its limits with normal mapping, specular lighting, and dynamic shadows that looked almost photorealistic compared to anything that had come before. NVIDIA fought back with the GeForce 6800. ATI answered with the X800 XT, and this back-and-forth battle between the two companies continued every 6 months like clockwork, with the performance crown changing hands so frequently that keeping track required a spreadsheet. For consumers, this competitive war was an absolute gift. Prices stayed reasonable, performance improved rapidly, and the best GPU available at any given moment was genuinely getting better faster than most people could keep up with. Then, in 2006, NVIDIA made a hardware decision that would quietly set in motion a chain of events extending far beyond gaming, eventually reshaping science, business, and artificial intelligence in ways that nobody in the gaming community had even begun to imagine. When NVIDIA released the GeForce 8800 GTX in November of 2006, reviewers genuinely struggled to find adequate words to describe how far ahead of the competition it was. It wasn't just that faster, it represented a completely different approach to GPU architecture called unified shaders, where instead of having separate specialized units for different types of calculations, every single shader processor could now handle any type of task assigned to it, making the entire chip dramatically more flexible and efficient. NVIDIA quickly realized something about this new architecture that went far beyond gaming. A GPU built this way wasn't just good at rendering pixels, it was extraordinarily good at any problem that could be broken into thousands of smaller calculations happening simultaneously, which described an enormous range of scientific and computational challenges that had nothing to do with video games whatsoever. In 2007, they released CUDA, a platform that allowed any programmer to write code that ran directly on the GPU for general-purpose computation. And while it didn't make many headlines in gaming circles, scientists working on physics simulations, weather modeling, and medical research immediately understood its significance. The world wasn't quite ready to fully appreciate what had just happened, but a small group of researchers at the University of Toronto took notice and began using NVIDIA GPUs to train something they called a neural network. And that quiet, almost unnoticed moment in a Canadian university lab was, in hindsight, the exact point where today's entire artificial intelligence revolution was first set into motion. If the previous era was defined by architectural breakthroughs, then the years between 2010 and 2016 were defined by one thing above all else: relentless, almost obsessive pursuit of raw performance at every price point. NVIDIA released the GTX 580, then the 680, then the 980, each generation delivering significant performance improvements over what came before, while AMD pushed back with their HD 6970, the R9290X, and the Fury X, making sure that NVIDIA never got comfortable enough to stop innovating. The demand driving all of this acceleration was genuinely enormous. 4K monitors started becoming available to consumers. Virtual reality headsets went from science fiction to actual retail products, and game developers were pushing graphical complexity to levels that required more GPU power than ever before in history. AMD and NVIDIA played a constant leapfrog game where whichever company fell behind would pour enormous resources into catching up, and whichever company pulled ahead would inevitably grow complacent just long enough to get overtaken again. A dynamic that kept prices competitive and performance growth rapid for everyone who benefited from their rivalry. By 2014, a $200 graphics card could run virtually every game available at high settings, which would have seemed like science fiction to anyone buying hardware a decade earlier. And yet, even with all this progress, the efficiency improvements that had come so easily were beginning to slow down as the physical limits of silicon manufacturing started to become a genuine obstacle. And it was becoming clear that simply shrinking transistors further and further wasn't going to work forever. In 2016, NVIDIA released the GTX 1080, built on a new 16-nanometer manufacturing process, down from the 28 nanometers used in the previous generation, and the resulting leap in power efficiency was so dramatic that the 1080 managed to outperform cards that had cost nearly twice as much while consuming significantly less electricity. But as impressive as that card was, it turned out to be merely the opening act for what NVIDIA was planning next. The real earthquake arrived in 2018 when NVIDIA unveiled the RTX 20 series and introduced ray tracing to consumer graphics hardware for the first time, a technology that fundamentally changed the way computers render light by abandoning the traditional approach of faking reflections and shadows with clever mathematical tricks and instead actually tracing the physical path of individual light rays through a scene exactly the way real physics works, producing results that looked genuinely unlike anything a consumer GPU had ever produced before. The trade-off was brutal. Enabling ray tracing cut frame rates roughly in half, even on the most expensive cards available. But the gaming community's reaction made it clear that people were willing to accept that cost just to experience what real-time lighting could look like when done properly. Also arriving with the RTX series was DLSS, a system where the GPU renders a scene at a lower resolution than your monitor, and then uses a neural network trained on thousands of high-resolution images to intelligently reconstruct the missing detail, producing an image that looks nearly identical to native resolution while running dramatically faster. And the fact that NVIDIA was now shipping consumer graphics cards with dedicated AI processing hardware built directly into them marked the permanent blurring of the line between a graphics chip and an artificial intelligence accelerator. Wait, AI on the GPU for games? The line between graphics chip and AI chip has just blurred permanently. In 2020, NVIDIA released the RTX 3090 with 24 gigabytes of memory and performance numbers that seemed almost fictional. But just as consumers were getting excited, something deeply strange happened to the market that had nothing to do with gaming at all. Cryptocurrency miners who discovered that GPUs were extraordinarily efficient at solving the calculations required to mine digital coins began buying every graphics card they could find in bulk. And when a global semiconductor shortage hit the entire industry simultaneously, the result was a complete collapse of normal retail pricing, where a GPU that should have cost $700 was regularly selling for $2,000 on secondary markets, and ordinary gamers simply could not buy hardware at any reasonable price for nearly 2 years. The world finally understood in a very concrete and painful way what researchers had been saying quietly for years. GPUs were no longer gaming hardware. They were critical infrastructure for the entire digital economy, and the demand for them extended far beyond anyone who had ever played a video game in their life. Then in late 2022, OpenAI launched ChatGPT, and within weeks it became the fastest-growing consumer application in human history, running on thousands of NVIDIA A100 data center GPUs simultaneously, meaning that every single question any of its hundreds of millions of users ever typed was being answered in real time by graphics processing units. NVIDIA's market value responded accordingly, eventually crossing $1 trillion and making it one of the most valuable companies ever to exist. The RTX 4090 that arrived in late 2022 was so powerful that reviewers struggled to find software demanding enough to actually stress it, and while AMD's RDNA 3 architecture finally offered a genuinely competitive alternative for creative professionals, NVIDIA's lead in AI-specific hardware kept them in a dominant position that showed no signs of weakening. By 2024 and into 2025, the RTX 5000 series introduced multi-frame generation, a technology where the GPU doesn't just render faster, it actually uses AI to invent entirely new frames that never existed in the original scene, extrapolating motion so convincingly that the human eye cannot tell the difference. And at that point, the performance numbers had become so disconnected from anything a game actually required that the primary buyers of the most powerful consumer GPUs were no longer gamers at all. As we move through 2026, the GPU is powering every AI model you interact with daily, every visual effect in every major film production, every self-driving vehicle simulation running in a data center somewhere, and scientific research that would have taken traditional computing clusters decades to complete is now finishing in days, and the chip generation after the current one is already being designed in labs right now, promising capabilities that we genuinely do not yet have the vocabulary to describe. What started as a clunky add-in card that could draw textured walls in a video game, a little bit faster than the CPU could manage on its own, has become, in the span of just 35 years, the single most strategically important category of technology on the entire planet. powering artificial intelligence for billions of people, enabling scientific discoveries that save lives, and still somehow also making your games look incredible in the process. If you want to understand how CPUs evolved across the same period and why the relationship between CPUs and GPUs defines almost everything about modern computing, that video is coming next. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. I'm Core, my brain has been running at 100% utilization this entire video, and I will see you in the next one.